Okay, let's get started because we have a lot to cover tonight. Hello, everyone. We're so glad to have you here for tonight's public meeting, introducing you to the Housing Black Washington Availability and Affordability 1790 to 1974 Multiple Property Document. My name is Zachary Burt. I'm the Community Outreach and Grants Manager for the DC Preservation League. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are DC's citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of the nation's capital. I have a few things to go over before we get started. First, I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite free programs like this one tonight. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, Douglas Development Corporation, QTAC Rock, Buyer Blender Bell, EHT Traceries, and KCE Structural Engineers. Thank you all for your dedication to historic preservation in Washington. And then tonight's meeting will have two parts, which is kind of the standard thing around here. First, Heather McMahon, the project's consultant, is going to get an overview of the project's findings. And then following Heather's presentation, we will open it up to questions and comments. We're looking forward to hearing from you, the community. So please drop in any observations, thoughts, questions, etc., into the Q&A box or the comment box at the bottom of your computer screen. And we'll be sure to get to those in the second half of the meeting. And just keep in mind, there's no audio option. So if you raise your hand, I won't be able to unmute you or anything like that. So please just type in your comment or question. So with that said, I'm excited to turn it over to Heather for her presentation. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you, Zach. That was kind of you. Hello and welcome to everybody. My name is Heather McMahon. I'm an architectural historian consultant, and I'm here tonight to review the research that I've undertaken into the places that Black Washingtonians have called home for nearly 2 centuries, from the city's founding in 1790 through the adoption of the district's Home Rule Charter in 1974. This research explores housing that's considered affordable, meaning it was intended for or inhabited by working class residents. It looks more closely at affordable housing for Black Washingtonians because African Americans have always made up a significant portion of the District of Columbia's working class, since racial restrictions kept many in lower wage, blue collar, or service sector jobs. The work of Black Washingtonians is visible. They helped build the White House, the US Capitol, Washington's grand avenues, and national monuments in the past, and Black Washingtonians continue to build the fabric of the city today. But their homes have often been invisible. Since the District of Columbia's founding, housing for African Americans had systematically been relegated to rear yards, back alleys, isolated neighborhoods, and undesirable locations. What I attempted to pull together in this multiple property document, or MPD for short, and for this presentation, is a story about access and affordability and resistance and policy that played out on Washington streets over a 180-year span. First, I would like to provide you with an overview for tonight's presentation, which should last about 50 minutes, after which, as Zach said, there will be ample time for questions and comments. In this presentation, I'll be focusing on the historic context of this thematic subject and delivering the narrative in a chronological order. I will also mention a few building types or forms as they arise. For the first 3 slides, I'll talk about the project genesis and mission and how it was accomplished. The remainder will be devoted to the story that the MPD tells. But just one quick note, the MPD is rather long and broad in scope. So in attempting to condense its material down for this presentation, many sub-narratives were omitted, and the headings and the organizational time spans that you see here for this presentation are not the same that I used in the MPD. So in other words, this presentation is a snapshot of the MPD, and it is not organized exactly like the MPD, but it's similar, chronologically ordered. Well, let's start with the purpose. The DC State Historic Preservation Office, or DC SHPO, has long been interested in the history of affordable and workforce housing in the District of Columbia. Affordable housing has always been and continues to be a salient issue in DC. In 2022, the DC SHPO received a grant from the National Park Service's Underrepresented Communities Grant program to underwrite the production of an MPD and associated National Register nominations related to this theme, the history of affordable housing in Washington, D.C., with a focus on housing for Black residents. The DC SHPO then contracted the DC Preservation League to manage the project, which will catalyze nominations to both the DC Inventory of Historic Sites and the National Register of Historic Places. A request for proposals for consultants was released in 2024. I responded with a proposal and was awarded this project. The research questions posed by the scope of this project were so vast that the sources and methods of inquiry were equally expansive. And I should say now that I did not undertake this massive project alone. Dr. Brian Jenkins, now at the University of South Carolina, assisted me with the research phase. Together, we read scores of secondary and primary sources and created an annotated bibliography that would inform our future work. And once the historic context had been written, the draft was reviewed by our advisory board, comprised of local subject matter experts, Drs. Amanda Huron, Tanya Golash-Boza, and Rosemary Ndibuzu. Their feedback helped shape the final context and refine my assumptions and some definitions of concepts. And I want to just take this moment to express my gratitude to them. The project scope required 5 ultimate deliverables. Firstly, that annotated bibliography that I just mentioned before. The version that we submitted in December 2024 had 36 distinct sources, but this number would triple by the end of the writing phase, as further research is needed while crafting a narrative. Secondly, Dr. Jenkins and I created 2 spreadsheets that identified sites associated with the theme, which we culled from the reading materials. Now, spreadsheet A lists existing sites, while spreadsheet D lists lost or non-existing sites. Sarah Schoenfeld was an immense help to me as I revised these spreadsheets several times over the course of the next year. With her assistance, we landed on 9 typological themes, which would help me further organize the MPD. And we identified 91 existing and 65 lost sites associated with affordable housing for Black Washingtonians over this nearly 200-year period. The ultimate deliverable is the MPD form, which comes in at about 150 pages, the bulk of which is the historic context, which we'll be discussing in this presentation. Lastly, the final 2 project deliverables are still in development. They are an individual nomination of a site associated with this MPD for the National Register, and the expansion of the boundaries for the LaDroit Park Historic District, which is already listed on the National Register. The expanded LaDroit Park Historic District will include several examples of affordable housing mentioned in this MPD, and a few are also mentioned in this presentation. The historic context of the MPD form, in my opinion, is the heart of the project, and it is what this presentation concerns. It recounts the developmental history of Washington, starting with the how the institution of slavery impacted the built environment and set the foundations for exclusion. The District of Columbia was carved out of 2 slaveholding states, whose Chesapeake model of plantation building seeded generations of site planning principles as well as building forms. DC was not devoid of human habitation when its boundary stones were laid in 1790, but was a patchwork of about 30 plantations held by 19 different proprietors. When Nicholas King surveyed all of the plantations in what would become Pierre L'Enfant's monumental city of Washington, he also mapped Notley Young's plantation, which is sited in what would become the Southwest Quadrant. And we're looking at that Nicholas King plat right here. Young was the largest slaveholder in the territory of Columbia, and he had a typical Chesapeake region plantation model with a big house colored in red at the center and ancillary buildings also colored in red that are seen there in a row. Farther afield was a village for enslaved field workers marked in these black squares and rectangles to the right. Note the sizes of the black shapes on the map. The larger rectangles are likely non-kin single-sex barracks for male field laborers, except for the one that's marked frame house, which may have been the residence of the overseer, who also has a garden, if you can see overseer's garden down there. The smaller squares denote cabins for family units. So two forms, barracks and cabins. We're going to see these later too. This map, however, is so two-dimensional that we have no sense of the topography, of whether the enslaved housing was fit into bottoms or shielded from the main house by woods. But what we can easily assess is its distance from the orderly big house and the big house's associated buildings. This leads to the concept out of sight, out of mind. Because the city of Washington was built from the ground up, literally, it was initially occupied by laborers constructing monumental government buildings, as well as housing, commercial buildings, and infrastructure, all the things the city needs. These laborers included native-born and immigrant whites, as well as enslaved and free blacks. Of this working landscape, the Secretary of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott, described the scene in a letter dated July 4th, 1800. Quote, "You may look in almost any direction over an extent of ground nearly as large as the city of New York without seeing a fence or any object except brick kilns and temporary huts for laborers." End quote. In regards to housing in these early days, Washington's elite was forging an economy based on speculative real estate, and they were intentionally constructing brick, street-facing row houses to sell or rent to people of means. If property owners were erecting workforce housing, or if the workers themselves were assembling structures and shelter for themselves, it would have been quickly and inexpertly assembled and thereby castigated by Walcott and his peers as temporary huts. However, even permanent housing at this time was modest in size and form. The predominant housing form in the District of Columbia in this period was the single-family detached house of wood frame or masonry construction. Depending on the number of rooms, the quality of the building materials, and the craftsmanship, such a house could be described as a manor or a hut. One-room cabins were the most common form for the laboring classes, both white and black. All of the living functions were performed in one main room, but cabins were typically additive. So as time passed and money was saved, lean-tos or additional rooms could be appended to the sides or rear. Both this drawing of a Black Washingtonians cabin from 1882 and this picture of an old house on Rock Creek Church Road from 1915 show distinct formal similarities that lasted for generations. Wood frame construction covered in clapboard siding, steeply pitched side gable roofs clad in shingles, end chimneys, and appended lean-tos on the side elevations. Single-room houses could also be constructed of masonry, although these were typically referred to as cottages rather than cabins. The Abigail Sides House at 2906 O Street Northwest in Georgetown is a brick dwelling constructed in 1813 for David English. Jane Threkheld English acquired the house in 1837 and sold it 10 years later to Abigail Sides, an African American woman who had been manumitted in the will of her deceased enslaver, John Barnes. Similar in form to the cabins on the previous slide, the Abigail Sides house rises one full story with an attic beneath a steeply pitched front gable roof. The small house is one room wide and two rooms deep with an appendage at the rear. And originally, this modest house would have only had a dirt floor. No, so you see, the real difference between white laboring class and gentry and black laboring class housing for this period is not the housing forms, but their siting. The story of Thomas Law is illustrative. In 1807, he manumitted 9 enslaved individuals and built what angry neighbors described as huts. I have to say, seems to have been just the worst thing you could call a house in around 1800, a hut. Bad word. They described these houses as huts, which they professed in a letter to Law that they were unhappy to see clearly from their parlor windows. Law built the dwellings, quote, on irregular land that would otherwise lie fallow, end quote. So, although Law's act may have been benevolent, the modest homes of recently liberated African Americans were still relegated to lands that could either not be used or were not wanted, and yet they still drew the condemnation of Law's white gentrified neighbors for their visibility. And here we get to the relegation of Black Washingtonians housing. As the Chesapeake plantation model was adapted to an urban setting, service structures and enslaved housing were relegated to backyards and often enclosed by very high walls so as not to be visible from the street. This is what we see here on the left image in this Nicholas King plat of Duddington Pasture from 1796. Duddington Pasture was the seat of the original proprietor Daniel Carroll, and it occupied an entire city block. And this two-dimensional, again, plat does not show it, but it was entirely surrounded by a wall. The yellow frame buildings in the upper right corner that are near that stable yard, well relegated behind the house, that's the enslaved housing. Architectural historian John Michael Vlach saw a direct evolutionary line from urbanizing Washington's enslaved cabins to alley dwellings, relegated as they all were to the rear of lots or the interior of squares, and occupied primarily by African Americans of the low social status. Vlach further considered the alley dwelling to be a particularly symptomatic of the district's residential developmental history as, in his own words, quote, the extraordinary number of alley houses that were built in Washington constitute a distinctive feature of the city's architectural history, end quote. Now, although L'Enfant's 1791 plan for Washington City did not depict alleyways, the original survey of squares undertaken between 1792 and 1796 show that interior alleys were always intended for Washington City. That because the city was so slow to develop, however, alleys were not really implemented, or at least lots on alleys were really not divided and subdivided until the 1850s. So they weren't really utilized, as far as we know, until about the 1850s. But by 1858, Boyd's Washington and Georgetown Directory listed 348 households in 49 different alley settlements, most of which were concentrated in the Northwest Quadrant, which had the densest development at that time. Although alleys were often racially segregated, both African Americans and whites of limited means dwelt in alleys during the decade prior to the Civil War, and in fact, the majority of alley dwellers in the 1850s were white. 65% of alley dwellers in the 1850s were white. Nothing changed Washington's housing landscape as dramatically or as suddenly as the Civil War. During the 5 years that the Civil War raged, an estimated 40,000 self-liberating African Americans flooded D.C. from slaveholding states. There really were few places to absorb these newcomers seeking liberation from bondage. Many established Black communities, such as Herring Hill and Georgetown, which had been growing since the late 18th century, took in these new arrivals. But Washington, as a pedestrian city, needed housing in all quadrants within walking distance to places of employment, and housing had always been short. So, the United States Army established contraband camps at forts and hospitals across the districts where they erected barracks and put self-liberating Black men and women to work for the Army. As one example, over a 13-month period, African Americans were housed in the vacated Army camp on Annalaston, which is now called Roosevelt Island, in 8 military barracks measuring 20.5 feet by 110 feet. The barracks, similar to what is seen here in this 1865 image of Fort Carroll, were described as wood frame, board and batten buildings without any insulation and open to the rafters. These barracks each contain rows of bunk beds stacked 3 high. Many of these contraband camps, by the way, as they were called, seeded late 19th century Black neighborhoods such as Meridian Hill and Reno City, just to name a couple. Between late 1866 and 1868, the Freedmen's Bureau rented apartments to free people in former military barracks like these, including the Kendall Gardens Barracks, which is now the site of Gallaudet University, and the Wisewell Barracks, which were located on the northwest corner of O and 7th Streets Northwest. At Campbell Hospital, they charged $3 per month rent for basically a room or a cubby in a decommissioned military barrack. These post-Civil War rental units, often overcrowded, were called tenements at the time, and honestly, occupation of them lasted well until the turn of the 20th century. The contraband camps and shantytowns that sprang up during the Civil War were criticized by Washington's white residents as undesirable eyesores. So the Freedmen's Bureau sought a more permanent solution. Taking note of white citizens' complaints, the Bureau attempted to resettle African Americans away from the urban core, out of sight in the hinterlands. First, they tried to acquire property in Meridian Hill for the establishment of a new Black neighborhood, since there had already been a large contraband community in that area. But resident protests scuttled that attempt. So they entered secret negotiations using a proxy to purchase 375 acres of floodplain and wooded hills east of the Anacostia River. There they platted Potomac City, better known as Berry Farm. The Bureau surveyed the land in June 1868 and platted 359 1 and 2 acre plots, which they sold to recently freed African Americans for a range from $125 to $300 per acre. The buyers had 2 years to complete the payment on the lots, but the Bureau also hired and paid freedmen $1.25 a day to clear the site's underbrush, fell trees, and cut new roads in this subdivision. Those who cleared the land had a percentage of their paychecks put into escrow, by the Bureau to help them purchase the lots in Berry Farm. By October of 1868, the majority of Berry Farm's lots had been sold, and by 1869, 266 families had erected houses with the assistance of carpenters that had been hired by the Bureau and with lumber and materials provided by the Bureau. These original Berry Farm houses, concentrated on Howard Road, contained only 2 rooms, one stacked on top of another, sheltered by a steeply pitched front gable roof. And the front gable is what we saw on the Abigail Sides house slide, if you recall. They were called A-frame for that reason. The ground floor room functioned as a dual living and dining room with a fireplace for cooking, and the upper room would have served as a bedchamber for every member of the family. If a family had means, or as time passed, they could purchase more building materials and add on to their home. The Bureau intended that the community be self-sufficient, and so residents had to demand utilities and municipal improvements, as well as build their own institutions. But within the first 2 years, Berry Farm had a school and 2 churches, as well as civic organizations. Neither the Army nor the Freedmen's Bureau could house all of the self-liberating African Americans coming into DC during the Civil War and immediately afterward. The private real estate market needed to step in to house these tens of thousands too. So the interiors of squares became densely developed almost overnight. The demographics of alley settlements changed in the post-Civil War decades so that they came to be associated with impoverished Black Washingtonians by the end of the 19th century. And as a statistic, by 1897, 89% of DC's alley dwellers were African American. There's an important distinction to be made about the alley dwellings built before the Civil War and after. Before the war, long urban lots were rarely subdivided. So there was communication or some sort of relationship between the property owner in the street-facing house and their tenants in the rear. These property owners also tended to build a few, like one or two accessory dwellings at one time. After the Civil War, however, when the demographics of alley dwellers shifted, alley lots were subdivided into separate parcels and were only accessible from alleyways. They had no communication to the street or to street-facing lots. So this severed any communication between inhabitants or owner of the street-facing lots. Furthermore, the alley dwellings were not typically owned by the same people who owned or inhabited the street-facing row houses. And by the end of the 19th century, alley dwellings had become the purview of a handful of developers who constructed tens of alley dwellings at a time and were more often than not absentee and neglectful landlords. Alley dwellings from the 1850s through 1870 are less definable by form, but qualify as such by virtue of being located in the interiors of urban blocks and not fronting public streets. Like the Charles Gedney drawing on the left, pre-Civil War housing forms either remained in place or were constructed anew by people with limited means in the interiors of squares, where the new urban wall became a series of brick row houses. Early alley dwellings were typically built individually or paired, sometimes in short rows, generally 4 units or less. They were wood frame, 1 or 2 stories in height, and lacked a foundation. They typically contained only 1 or 2 rooms and had no access to sewerage or water mains. Tenements are associated with alley dwelling, although they were also sometimes street facing. The term tenement could refer to older row houses that were overcrowded with inhabitants of little means, or it could refer to purpose-built multifamily dwellings. In his 1909 book, Charles Weller, a social reformer who took on the deplorable conditions of Washington's alleys, described the Douglas Flats as a tenement, saying it was a livery stable with box stalls, but instead of horses, 41 human families were crammed into 54 dwelling rooms. The Douglas Flats, which are no longer extant, were located at 25th Street between M and N Streets Northwest. It was a 40-foot wide by 208-foot deep building constructed of wood frame. That's similar to what we see here on this image on the left, which is a photograph taken circa 1909 by Lewis Hines of a tenement in DC. Hines actually illustrated Weller's book with photographs. So although I do not know if this is the Douglas Flats, it's very similar to the description of the Douglas Flats. Inside the Douglas Flat building was a double-loaded corridor, a double-loaded central corridor, which accessed 30 rooms on 2 floors. At the center of each floor were 2 gender-separated water closets with cement floors, which contained a faucet, a toilet, and a hopper for sops. Only 2 families could afford 3 rooms. 10 families rented 2, and the vast majority were crowded into 1 room. A series of regulations in the 1870s modestly improved the forms of alley dwellings. After the 1872 fire codes were enacted, all newly constructed alley dwellings within the Washington city's fire limits were of brick construction. And then another law passed in 1877 required that every new building have either an indoor toilet or an outhouse. By the 1880s and 1890s, alley dwellings followed a standardized building form that did not deviate. Masonry construction, 2 stories, 2 bays wide, set on a low foundation and capped with a low-pitched sloping roof that was sheathed in tin. The facades were flat, they did not have any projections, but they were sometimes moderately embellished with a shared cornice made of corbelled bricks, or they might be decorated with molded brick window hoods. You can see both of those embellishments here on these alley dwellings in Dingman Place Northeast in the photo to the right. Generally, the footprints of these were very small, 12 to 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep. Their railroad style plans entailed a 12 by 10-foot front room accessed directly from the street, a rear room of the same dimensions that held the staircase to the second floor, and then often a 1-story lean-to kitchen would be appended to the rear. If the kitchen did not contain the toilet, there was an outhouse and possibly sheds in a backyard that sometimes only measured 7 to 19 feet deep. Many of DC's alleys were blind as well as narrow, meaning they were dead ends. This lack of through street connection, compounded by the manner in which lots were subdivided, fostered isolation, but also self-sufficient alley communities, where the racial and socioeconomic demographics inside a city block could differ drastically from the demographics of the street-facing lots on the exterior of that same block. By the turn of the 20th century, alley housing had become distinctly associated in the minds of the public with impoverished African Americans, also with poor hygiene, lack of sanitation, and the spread of disease. Locally and nationally prominent social welfare reformers began concerted lobbying efforts to have alley dwellings in DC demolished, but without providing sufficient plans to rehouse alley residents. Only one means really emerged in this era to systematically address unsuitable housing for DC's laboring classes, and that was a privately funded initiative for philanthropic housing. The Washington Sanitary Improvement Company, or WSIC, was incorporated in 1897 as a limited dividend development corporation. They sought private investors to whom they promised 5% returns on their investments, capped. The WIC then purchased land, hired architects and contractors, and built new housing stock for skilled laborers. This distinction is important. The WSIC did not build for the city's most impoverished, but for the next class up, believing that rising tides lift all boats. So in this, theory, if a carpenter's family left their domicile for a new WSIC dwelling, their old vacated home could absorb the needier alley dwellers. The WSIC was actually so immediately successful that by 1904, a second limited dividend company was founded, the Washington Sanitary Housing Company, or WSHC. Now, it actually capped returns at 4% and was interested in housing the needier level of society that the WSIC had not been. So, the unskilled laboring classes was the focus of the WSHC. But together, these two philanthropic housing companies built over 1,200 affordable units for both white and black occupancy between 1897 and their dissolution in 1950. This was the only sustained effort at creating affordable housing in DC before publicly funded housing initiatives began with the New Deal. The forms that WSIC and WSHC popularized, or the form, I should say, singular, was the two-family flat. A two-family flat had 2 dwelling units, one stacked on top of the other, a form otherwise known as a duplex. As expressed on the exterior, it is hard to distinguish between a single-family row house and a two-family flat. The number of entrances was the telltale sign in the beginning. The number of rooms within a two-family flat could vary. The smallest model was a two-room unit, and you can see a plan for a two-room unit on your right. In 1907, the WSHC created 40 two-room flats on two-family flats on Van Street Southwest, which are seen in the photograph on the left. In this two-room floor plan, the back living room and kitchen measured 16 by 14 feet, and you can see this chamfered corner, which holds a small bathroom. The front room served as the bedroom and measured 12 by 14 feet, so very small spaces. The two-family flat model, however, became widely popular as an affordable housing type for private developers, as well as the WSIC and WSHC. By 1932, 46% of all the residences in the district were two-family flats. The philanthropic housing movement embodied by the WSIC and the WSHC laid the groundwork for the emergence of federally financed public housing in the second and third quarters of the 20th century. They proved that building housing for society's most vulnerable could be done and could be profitable. But the hardships of the Great Depression made the issues of poverty, unemployment, and housing shortages so acute that the private market alone could not address them sufficiently. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated president in January of 1933, he offered a New Deal to America and set about creating alphabet agencies to put Americans back to work and to provide housing. DC had experienced a prolonged house construction drought since World War I that made finding available and affordable housing particularly difficult for people of modest means. In 1932, a Senate committee of the US Congress undertook an investigation of rental conditions in the District of Columbia. And after surveying one quarter of all rental units across the district, they surmised that, quote, due principally to the economic depression and resulting unemployment, and partly due to the failure of rents to decrease to any great extent, thousands of Washington tenants have suffered and are suffering great hardships, humiliation, and discomfort, end quote. Homeowners had difficulties too, as foreclosure rates skyrocketed. To help homeowners, Roosevelt's administration founded the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, in 1933. Now, the HOLC was intended to assist first-time homebuyers as well as support existing homeowners who could not afford to make their mortgage payments by amortizing their loans. In the beginning, the HOLC supported applicants of both races. But between 1935 and 1940, the HOLC created residential security maps of major US cities that assessed the riskiness of a loan made by banks, savings and loans, and other mortgage lenders. Their color-coded maps graded entire neighborhoods from A, which meant safe, to D, which meant hazardous. Safe neighborhoods were colored green, while hazardous areas were colored red, and this is where we get the term redlining. Without fail, Black neighborhoods were marked red to identify them as high risk, regardless of residents' incomes levels. This resulted in Black homeowners either being denied loans altogether or offered loans at higher interest rates. Redline neighborhoods received less infrastructural maintenance, fewer public services, and less political attention than Greenline neighborhoods that were predominantly, if not exclusively, white occupied. This neglect accelerated decay, which in turn was used as justification for further neglect. The HOLC might not have created segregation. Scholars argue that the maps were reflective of practices already on the ground. Yet their maps did codify and finance segregation, discriminatory lending practices, and institutional cycles of disinvestment. Now, just a note about this image on the left. No HOLC risk assessment map of Washington is known to exist. This map was made in 1937 by another New Deal program, the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA. The FHA graded every habitable block in DC from A to H, based directly on the racial composition of each street. Nearly the entirety of Old Washington City, Georgetown, Shaw, and Anacostia, or the areas east of the Anacostia River, received a grade of F for declining rapidly. The neighborhoods with the highest Black occupancy, including areas east of the Anacostia River, received grades of G and H. The FHA then used these grades to determine where to provide insured loans. Unsurprisingly, very few loans were insured in Black majority neighborhoods. And because developers needed FHA backing to secure financing, very little new housing was built for Black residents through the mid 20th century, while hundreds of thousands of units were built for white residents in the surrounding suburbs. One exception is Mayfair Mansions, constructed south of Kenilworth, east of the Anacostia River between 1942 and 1946. Developed by Black entrepreneurs and designed by Black architect Albert I. Cassell, Mayfair Mansions was the largest FHA-financed housing development for African Americans in the district. When it opened, the waiting list had 5,000 families on it, which testifies to the demand for and the dearth of decent new housing stock for Black Washingtonians. However, I just want to point out that Mayfair Mansions was targeted in terms of rental costs to the Black middle class, so not lower income persons. Mayfair Mansions comprised groups of three-story walk-up apartment buildings set in a park-like setting that reflected garden apartment design principles that were very popular in the 1930s and 40s. Mayfair Mansions also demonstrated that Black Americans could meet FHA underwriting criteria and that Black-led development was viable. Before we move forward, it's worth pausing to understand where geographically Black Washingtonians were living across the district, because location is central to the story, and I have not been enveloping it in the narrative so far. So I want to step back a little bit. Until the Civil War, housing was built within walking distance of centers of employment. It's a pedestrian city. And settlement had little to do with either race or economic standing. This pattern is exemplified by the story of Alethea Browning Turner, an enslaved woman who sold vegetables in Lafayette Square and earned enough money to purchase her freedom as well as property. Her house, which had been located on H and 14th Streets Northwest, was described at the time as handsome. By 1860, she shared the same H Street block with the city's wealthiest banker, William Wilson Corcoran, and a successful African-American hotelier, James Wormley. So this anecdote reflects the racial and class integration that was more common in the first half of the 19th century, although, again, this integration was limited. And as anthropologist James Borchardt wrote in his 1980 book about DC's alley communities, in the decades leading up to the Civil War, Black Washingtonians were found in virtually every part of the city, but they tended to cluster in small groups in the core and to form enclaves outside of it. This core periphery model accelerated with suburbanization and a little legal exclusionary vehicle called racially restrictive covenants. Restrictive covenants are clauses written into property deeds of title that prohibit people of certain races or cultures or religions from buying, leasing, or inhabiting that property in perpetuity. Uniontown was the first true suburban development established in the district. It was founded just east of the Anacostia River in 1854, right across the 11th Street Bridge, and it was marketed to laboring Navy Yard workers. But racial covenants in the property titles ensured that Uniontown remained a white neighborhood for decades. So when Berry Farm was established as an all-black neighborhood right next door, suddenly the scale of segregation in DC enlarged from the scale of a block or pockets within a neighborhood to entire neighborhoods and subdivisions themselves. Racially restrictive covenants were used heavily in the suburban developments that transformed the rural areas outside of the city of Washington from the 1870s through the 1940s. Entire new suburbs like Bloomingdale, Congress Heights, Chevy Chase, Mount Pleasant, Columbia Heights, just to name a few, were legally closed to Black buyers. This market pressure resulted in a simultaneous centrifugal and centripetal force in which DC's neediest demographic, lower income Blacks, were pushed to the edges of the district or sequestered within interior alleyways in the densest parts of the city. This marginalization can be seen, perhaps, in this color-coded map, which was also prepared by the FHA in 1937. This map recorded housing in DC by rent levels. The yellow and orange blocks represent areas in which rents were under $30 per month. Now, this isn't to say that the yellow and orange coded blocks were exclusively or even predominantly occupied by Black Washingtonians. Black Washingtonians of varying incomes lived throughout the district, as they always had. But if this paper is concerned with where Black laboring Americans could find affordable housing, those that were earning the lowest wage could find affordable housing, we cannot ignore these yellow and orange squares. And so it might not be surprising to also find that that there are entire areas of yellow and orange squares that align with 19th century Black neighborhoods, such as, and I don't know if my cursor can work, but Berry Farm is right there in the center on the right side, colored yellow and orange. We see Deanwood and Burville in the top right corner is predominantly yellow and orange. And Shaw, which is in the center of the map, kind of north of the midpoint, right below Florida Avenue, also largely yellow and orange. Unfortunately, the federal programs that were initiated in the 1930s to create affordable housing for all of DC's lower income residents did little to integrate the races. Firstly, the public housing projects themselves were segregated by race. Secondly, siting decisions were typically based on the availability and affordability of open land, which meant that housing for the city's neediest was once again pushed to the edges, or it required the redevelopment and displacement of alley communities in the interiors of dense urban blocks. DC's Alley Dwelling Authority, or ADA, was established in 1934. John Ilder, the director of the ADA in 1940, described the organization thus, quote, "The job given to the Alley Dwelling Authority is to reclaim slums, redevelop them for uses to which their sites are best fitted, and to assure an adequate supply of good, low rental dwellings, supplementing what private enterprise does," end quote. Naturally, then, the ADA set about clearing alleys in the oldest and densest parts of the city of Washington and its close first ring suburbs. The ADA's earliest project for African American occupancy required clearance of a place called The Camp. That's a 3-block area in Howardtown that municipal leaders considered blighted. After raising older vernacular houses, the ADA constructed the Williston Apartments in 1935 and 1937. These are two 3-story walk-up buildings designed by Homer J. Smith. They were placed on either side of a landscape courtyard that fronts W Street Northwest, and they basically reflect garden apartment design principles. On the next block to the west, the ADA built 18 single-family row houses between 1936 and 1938. They were called the V Street houses, and they were two-story brick units that were staggered into a horseshoe-shaped pattern around a landscaped courtyard. On the same two squares and a third, the ADA constructed the Kelly Miller dwellings in 1941. Now, this apartment complex included 15 buildings that were a combination of townhouses and three-story walk-up apartment buildings. And you can see some of the Kelly Miller buildings in the photo on the right. The ADA located segregated public housing in already established, predominantly Black neighborhoods, such as their 313-unit Frederick Douglass dwellings, which they built in Garfield in 1940 to 1942. By 1943, when the ADA became known as the National Capital Housing Authority, or NCHA, their site selection strategy, as well as their core mission, shifted. Firstly, all further projects were allocated as defense housing for war workers, both white and Black. Secondly, whereas alley clearance and redevelopment had been the strategy of the ADA in the pre-World War II years, the sudden need for quick and cheap construction necessitated that future projects be built on open and less expensive land, which was primarily located in wards 7 and 8 east of the Anacostia River. The NCHA continued to build Black occupant housing in already established Black areas, thereby entrenching that patchwork map of segregation that had defined DC since the post-Civil War era. The NCHA continued to expand its public housing stock after the war, and by the late 1960s, DC had more than 20,000 public housing units. A quick look at this NCHA map of their holdings in 1963 shows the largest developments were clustered east and southeast of the Anacostia River. Closer examination, however, shows that several projects had been built by that time inside the bounds of the old city of Washington within the southwest and southeast quadrants. This latter development was the result of a planning paradigm that had come into favor after World War II called urban renewal. In 1945, Congress passed the Redevelopment Act, which enabled the District of Columbia Redevelopment Land Agency, or RLA, to use eminent domain to acquire land and resell it to private developers at a below market rate. The Housing Act of 1949 established a federal urban redevelopment program, which was formally renamed Urban Renewal in 1954. Both acts authorized large-scale redevelopment of what they considered blighted areas by providing loans and grants to local agencies to clear slums and replace them with modern housing. The most famous of these urban renewal districts in DC is the Southwest Urban Renewal Area B. Southwest Urban Renewal Area B was planned primarily as a low-rent residential area. In 1953, the RLA invited developers to submit redevelopment plans for Area B, and from 1954, city planners demolished thousands of dwellings deemed substandard and replaced them with market-rate housing. However, by 1959, private market influences had remade Southwest for residents with much higher levels of income. And of 5,900 units, new units, only 5% were considered moderately affordable. This resulted in the widespread displacement of Black residents from Southwest. The modernist apartment complexes and office towers that replaced the original fabric in Area B were marketed primarily to middle-class white residents, and very few displaced Black residents were able to meet the new rents or return to the quadrant. One exception was Greenleaf Gardens, built in 1957 by the NCHA. Greenleaf Gardens presented a departure for the NCHA's use of low-scale walk-up apartments and row houses. Partly because the site was in the urban core and therefore cost more to purchase and develop, and partly because garden apartment site design principles were a little passé by this point, the NCHA maximized their parcel by constructing 2 mid-rise elevator-style apartment blocks, one 5 stories and the other 8. However, the NCA continued to build more spacious garden apartment complexes east of the Anacostia River as well, including Benning Terrace, Stoddart Terrace, Hillside Gardens, Woodland Terrace, and Anacostia Gardens between 1958 and 1965. But by the late 1960s, given mounting construction costs, the NCHA shifted tactics once again and began purchasing newly built properties that had been privately developed in a process they referred to as turnkey. They focused on high-rise, elevator-style buildings of 10 stories or more. But even with this increased maximization of dwelling units, demand unabatedly continued to far exceed supply. Despite the design ambitions, these high-rise complexes quickly became symbols of concentrated poverty and became entangled in the politics of race and respectability. Federal rent ceilings, despite price hikes in 1969, failed to keep pace with maintenance costs. Many residents lived in deteriorating buildings, awaiting renovation that never came. Public housing had fallen from general favor and federal funds dwindled. So the NCA shifted its development paradigm once again, focusing now on projects that utilized public-private partnership funding models that aimed to build mixed income and mixed use communities that would attract private investment. And on the left, you see a rendering of architect Paul Rudolph's for Fort Lincoln, which was conceived in 1966, was still mostly under construction by 1970. It was conceived as a new town with moderate income development, public housing for the elderly, commercial properties, and recreational facilities, so that a mix of people were living together in a somewhat more organic style of community. The age of urban renewal came to an end with the passage of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. The act responded to the failures of urban renewal by shifting funding and agency to state and local governments, and by promoting a less top-down approach to new and redevelopment. This paradigm shift coincidentally aligns with another milestone in DC history. In 1974, Walter E. Washington, who had started his career with the ADA and rose to direct the NCHA in the 60s, was elected Washington's first mayor following the passage of the District of Columbia Home Rule Act of December 1973. Washington brought to the mayoralty a lifetime of public service committed to providing more affordable housing for DC residents. At the same time, in July 1974, the NCHA was reorganized as the District of Columbia Housing Authority, or DCHA, which still maintains the many affordable housing projects built by the ADA and NCHA. Today, DCHA provides housing assistance to nearly 10% of the district's residents. At the end of this presentation, I want to underscore that throughout every era, Black Washingtonians built their own communities, such as Berry Farm, Burrville, Deanwood, Kingman Park, and many others. African American property owners hired local Black architects, such as Louis Giles, and contractors like the Randolph brothers, who worked extensively in Deanwood, to build homes. Some Black Washingtonians built their own homes with their own hands or bought catalog houses through the mail in order to avoid hassle or being overcharged based on their race. Black Washingtonians with means developed entire neighborhoods, such as James Henry Merriweather, a local lawyer who became a real estate developer and constructed a row of 27 attached houses in Heckman Street in Southwest. Renters formed cooperatives. They lobbied Congress for legislation that would protect them from landlord exploitation and generally advocated for better housing conditions for DC's most marginalized. In the interest of time, this presentation has not comprehensively reviewed the entire historical context written in the Housing Black Washington MPD, nor does it even cover all the building typologies discussed in the MPD. But I want to make it clear that although this presentation has focused on hindrances to availability and affordability that Black Washingtonians faced over 2 centuries, that DC's Black residents have always had agency, have resisted these market practices and federal policies that affected them disproportionately, and have themselves sustained thriving communities throughout the present day. Thank you for attending this presentation. I am terribly sorry that I ran a little late, but we still have a good half hour to take questions, and I will turn it back to Zach.
Thank you, Heather. That was very comprehensive. And I guess there's even more in the multiple property document. So
Yes, there's more.
yeah, that was great. So we already have some questions slash comments.
Okay.
But please, everyone, feel free to enter more questions and comments because, as Heather mentioned, we have a little bit of time for that. So, someone said, great presentation. Were you able to find any interior photos or drawings of 1800s or earlier housing to understand material culture and placemaking?
That's a great question. So I would say that the way I approach this MPD, the temporal scope from 1790 to 1974, the geographic scope is not so huge. I mean, DC is what, it's confined at least, but it's still a lot of neighborhoods. So between the geographic scope, the temporal scope, the typological scope, I mean, I looked at, 18th century single family detached cabins to, high-rise apartment buildings. So the way that I approached this was really high level, like macro information. And I unfortunately could not get down in the weeds. I'd like to think that this multiple property document might foster more intensive investigation into certain typologies and into certain building forms and what, for towards your question, what an 18th century Chesapeake style house or hall and parlor house might have looked like on the inside. But sadly, no, I did not do that for this.
Yeah, and I think that's where something like a historic landmark nomination would become
Yeah.
useful, where you can dive deeper into a particular typology.
Yeah.
Um, oh, and by the way, on the typologies, I mean, I know this wasn't part of your presentation necessarily, but could you just give us a few of the typologies? Maybe some of the more prominent ones.
Yeah, sure. So, and this is off the top of my head because I don't have a script in front of me
No,
that
I
I'm
know, I
reading
totally
from.
get it.
But so there are single family detached, there are semi-attached or paired houses, there are attached houses, which are row houses, there are multifamily apartment buildings, and those vary from like walk-ups, and then you have walk-ups, and then you have garden apartments, which are a certain type of design principles for walk-ups, and then you have mid-rise and high-rise and elevator style.
Oh,
So
wow.
basically, you have triplexes and duplexes and quadplex, but the family flats were my favorite because you've got a two-family flat, a three-family flat, which is a triplex, a four-family flat, a six-family flat, an eight-family flat. You've got barracks. I actually also mentioned, I think I took it out, but the canal boat is a form in which laboring classes of
Mhm.
white and Black Washingtonians lived in one room.
Mhm.
I talked about center hall plan houses, hall and parlor, Georgian style plans of houses. I would say it's been called various things, but if you asked me what is DC's like historic affordable housing type or vernacular
Yeah.
form, besides the row house, I would actually say it's this Italianate house that uses the two-thirds or one-third Georgian floor plan layout. So my MPD talks a lot about floor plan layouts and just the evolution of style and size. Oh, and I forgot catalog houses. There's an entire
Oh,
section on
right.
catalog houses too. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's a
Yeah.
lot. Yeah.
And even though you said, a small geographical area, that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of typologies, I'm realizing.
Yeah.
We have
Yeah.
a
Well,
lot.
and I mean, small to, I mean, it's not like I did this for the whole state of Virginia, but DC's got a lot of neighborhoods, and I
Yeah,
know a lot of neighborhoods now.
right. Oh, for
I know a
sure.
lot. Yeah.
For sure. Someone asked, are the shown HOLC maps now considered the missing WDC redlining maps? Do you want to maybe define what those acronyms are again for the audience, or maybe you're not familiar with those particular
Well,
ones?
so I think they're asking about the homeowners loan corporation
Yeah.
map,
Yeah,
which
huh? Yeah.
were these risk assessment maps that they did
Yeah.
for that the company did for every city. I'm not sure I understand the question. What I tried to convey is that in my research, everything that I've read is that no one knows whether a map for Washington, D.C. was ever made by the HOLC. And if it was made, it's lost to time and to scholars. No one's seen one in like, I don't
Okay.
know, since the 80s or 90s. So I don't know, was that the question that was
Yeah, and
being
I'm
asked?
wondering, maybe they can give a little bit more information, because they say, is this now considered the missing maps, the missing WDC maps? Which makes me wonder if there's a general idea that there are these missing maps. But to your point, we don't even know if they were ever created to begin with, it sounds like.
Well, for DC, we don't know. I mean,
DC
I have
specifically.
seen HOLC maps for many cities,
Right.
but when I was trying to find the one for DC, I ran into other scholars who had done the work before me and said, there's no evidence that one was ever made. We don't know for certain that one was ever made for DC, and if it was, none, we don't know where it is. We can't find it. Um,
Yeah.
so that, yeah, and
Okay.
I'm resting my laurels on that on my peers for doing the work
Yeah.
before.
Yeah. And if whoever wrote that question, if you want to just elaborate a little bit, that would be great, or not, up to you. Someone said, "Hi Heather, great presentation!" Exclamation
Thank you.
point. Question: You
Yeah.
classified the enslaved quarters at Notley Young's plantation as either family cabins or barracks. Was this based on the Nicholson watercolor plat and your knowledge about typologies of enslaved quarters and the size of the footprint, or did you find some written description or other archival document?
Oh, no. Yeah. Sorry. I mean, I wish that I had unearthed something as amazing as an archival document that literally says these were barracks and these were, family unit cabins. No, I'm gonna admit to you that I made these suppositions based on my own knowledge of just what was traditional housing forms for enslaved workers in the Chesapeake region, and then based on the footprints of that map. Um, it's supposition. It is. It is a little strange to me when you look really closely at that map that the forms are so different, that there are these like two very long buildings and then these, what I have to assume are cabins. And the key only says, I think I don't want to use their terminology, but it says enslaved housing or enslaved dwellings, right? And so I don't know more than that from the map itself. But that long one just really, I just think it has to have been something, if it is a dwelling and not an agricultural. So the blue buildings on the map are agricultural, right? So we know just from the coloration of it being black that it is a dwelling of some sort. But its size being so distinctly long suggests to me that it's probably a non-kin single sex barrack. So yeah, I wish I found like a silver bullet, like Notley Young's diary that was like, I went over to the barracks today, but I did not. So
Yeah. And can you remind everyone where generally Notley Young's plantation was?
yeah, it's Southwest Waterfront, so like Banneker Park area
Okay.
today.
Uh-huh.
Like I think that's pretty high up in the lakes. I feel like I need to look at a map now, but I want to say like C or D or maybe G.
Okay.
I don't know.
That
Somewhere.
general
Yeah.
vicinity. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, Heather, you mentioned the spreadsheets at the beginning. You said
Mhm.
there's a spreadsheet of extant buildings and then a spreadsheet of lost
Mm.
properties. I guess I should just say properties instead of buildings. Is that correct? There's these two spreadsheets. Can you
Fair.
talk just a little bit more about those? Like how many generally are on both lists?
Yeah, so
And how do you filter that?
well,
Um,
that was quite a challenge for me. And that was again, I'm a shout out to Sarah Schoenfeld for helping me really organize that better and cull some things. Because there was so much information out there and there were so many things that we were interested in trying to understand, and we were just kind of like assembling data and throwing it in a spreadsheet and then having to figure out whether some of the things that we assembled were actually accurate or deserved to be in the spreadsheet. It really took like a few set of eyes to help us winnow it down. So, of the 91 sites that are extant, they are some of the ones we've seen in this. So, the Abigail Sides House has made the extant list, right? Like it started off. It is now part of the Mount Zion community. It's called the Mount Zion Community House. It's part of the church, but it was a residence, and it still exists. So, it made that list. There is only one cabin from the 19th century that I am aware of that exists today. It is on the National Register. It is the Wetzold Archbald House or cabin.
Mhm.
It was not necessarily inhabited by African Americans, though, so it did not make the list.
Oh, I
So
see. Okay.
we don't have too many examples of surviving 18th century forms that we know to, or that I would say were affordable housing types that were known to have been inhabited by African Americans. We don't have a lot of that. That's the most of the list, most of the typologies that are on the existence spreadsheet are 20th century or late. They could be a lot of alley houses made the existing spreadsheet. So late 19th century to 20th century. So most of the projects that I mentioned in the NCHA and ADA public housing projects that I mentioned, and the a few, about half of the WSIC and WSHC philanthropic housing things, they still exist and they made it onto that spreadsheet. A lot of demolished alley dwellings that we came across in our reading material, demolished WSIC, WSHC, demolished public housing projects like Arthur Capper or Ellen Wilson dwellings. They made it into the other spreadsheet of things that are lost. And most of the Civil War stuff, especially the barracks, any of that material, it was ephemeral to begin with. It was wood frame. It was not meant to last. They're gone. So all of that made it into the lost spreadsheet as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess also because we've mentioned multiple property document a lot, which is a very historic preservation centric term, right? We use that a lot if we're talking about the National Register. And I guess maybe if you could just speak briefly about the importance of that laying the groundwork for landmark nominations, right? Because that's what people think about usually. They think of landmark nominations and getting a listing in the National Register. And so could you
Sure.
speak just a little bit
Yeah.
to the importance of that list and what the list means?
Yes.
Practical purposes, I
So
guess.
okay. Yeah, the multiple property document is a vehicle. The National Park Service, National Register of the Keeper, uh, vehicle in order to create a thematic, subject-oriented context like this. So you could do a multiple property document of, 1960s motels at the beach or, affordable housing in Washington, D.C. It just allows scholars to provide a historic context and to identify the types of buildings and forms that apply to that context so that future scholars can literally go out into the field, recognize that type of building form, refer to this context, and help nominate that particular building or site to the National Register. So it is this comprehensive umbrella tool that allows preservationists to, again, identify and then document and then use that history that's already been built for them to support their argument for nominating an individual site or a district.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's really well said and helpful to the audience. And if anyone's curious to see more of these multiple property documents that have been completed for the district, you can check those out at DCPL's website. And there's ones that are focused on typologies like banks and apartment buildings. And this will eventually be added to the list. And then there's ones that are more thematic that, cover civil rights and different types of histories. Um, so thank you for adding that. And I think it's also important to mention too that the MPD doesn't protect the buildings as landmarks because sometimes people have said to me, "Oh, so now all these buildings are protected," and I go, "No, it's really just laying the groundwork, right, from a more of an academic standpoint." Um, Someone asked, and I think this is actually, I don't think there's any more comments or questions, but if anyone has any, please add those in. But I think this might be kind of a good closing question. So someone said, "Great talk. Always like to hear about alleys." Yes, alleys are a perennial favorite here in the district. Sorry if I missed it, but can we access the MPD? And I think this is a good kind of closure for tonight. And you can sort of talk about next steps and when people will be able to access this.
Yes. Well, honestly, our SHPO colleagues might want to comment on this first. I mean, so the MPD on my end has been submitted to my clients who are DC SHPO and DC Preservation League. But I assume since it is a National Park Service grant, or it's been underwritten by a grant, that the National Park Service will also review this document, and when it is finished being reviewed by these two agencies, I believe that DC SHPO will create a permanent URL address and upload the PDF to that URL address and kind of promote it and roll it out and make it well known that it becomes available. I do not know what the time span is. It may be a month or two.
Yeah, and
Sorry. Yeah.
yeah, I see Kim Williams from HPO. She's raised her hand. Kim, if you could just drop the comment or the question, or not the question rather, but the comment in the chat, that would be great. That would give us a little bit of clarity on that. And of course, we've worked on many MPDs before here at DCPL, and we always promote them once they're public, put them in the newsletter, put them on our website. Obviously, we want this document to be accessible. Heather, we want people to read your work. We want to get traction. Um, while Kim writes that, maybe we actually have another question that came in. This is
Okay.
always a popular topic. Whenever I speak to people about architecture, they always are interested in catalog homes. That's just like a
Mm,
really fun topic for a lot of people.
yeah.
And do you have any
Yeah.
just additional insight on that about maybe where they were clustered, where you can see a lot of catalog homes? I have a couple neighborhoods in mind, but I would like to hear what you
Yeah.
have to say.
So this was great. I also just have a very keen fondness for catalog homes, and I think it's because I just really enjoy the bungalow style. Like that style speaks to me. So catalog homes. But catalog homes can vary in style. They can be neo-colonial to bungalow style or artsy craftsy or whatever. And they vary in size and they vary in the amount of money that they cost. So I think we associate catalog homes with affordable housing a lot, but they're not always affordable housing. So when I think about where in DC are there lots of catalog homes, the Palisades, like Sherrier Place has a lot of them, and Cleveland Park has a lot of them, and those are nice catalog. Those are the higher end of the
Yeah.
catalog
Yeah, very
houses,
high
right?
style.
They're high style. They're
Yeah.
they're not, they're not your kit house that you think of when you use the word kit. My research for this was predicated on a data set that the DC SHPO office provided to me. They have, if anybody here is familiar, they have a lot of data and ArcGIS maps on their website. They have taken historic building permits and they've built DC History Quest. They've got a lot of different data on a different website called DC Research Quest. And one of the things that they did was they cataloged something like, oh my good, I think it was 2,000 known catalog houses across DC. And so I would get into this map and I would find these points and I would find these clusters. But the problem was I had to use the building permit data to figure out more information about this. So who were the owners, right? Now, the permit's not going to tell you whether the original owner was a white or a black person. So then I had to go to census data and figure out, can I find this person in the census? Can I determine their race, etc.? And I really actually only found three that I know to have been owned originally by Black occupants.
Oh, wow.
One was built really early on, which is great because catalog houses, they started in the late 19th century, but in DC, they really don't take off until the 1920s, which is this era that we associate with catalog houses. But this one was built in 1913 in Burrville, which is up in that Deanwood corner, up in the eastern corner. There was one that was ordered as late as 1945, and it was down in Garfield. And then there was kind of a mid-range one, like a really kind of nice one that a teacher at the Armstrong School had built in Capitol View. He bought a plot in Capitol View,
Wow.
and he built one there. So sadly, I can't say much more about where they're clustered. I just know about these three individual cases. I think this is a great research topic.
Yeah.
If someone wanted to spend more time looking at the data that DC SHPO has on catalog houses with the building permits and getting every owner's name and then cross-referencing them with census data and figuring out who these owners were, that's a research project right there.
Totally.
I,
We
yeah,
just created a graduate school project.
I did. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for
I want to
summer.
see it happen.
No,
Yeah,
that
for
was really
summer.
helpful. And they were also wondering too about African American locations. And so that was helpful to hear about the three, which is that's wild that only three of them that you could confirm. But yeah,
Yeah.
Capitol View, Deanwood, and Garfield, sounds like.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so now I think here's our final statement. Kim chimed in, and she said that the Historic Preservation Office will take the MPD to the Historic Preservation Review Board, where it will then be sent to the National Register. And this is all tied to the landmark nominations that are coming with this document. And that will be based on the list that you were talking about. And DCPL and HPO and Heather, we're all working together on what the landmark nominations are going to be. So stay tuned for that. But basically, Kim is just saying, though, that still that won't prevent us from posting the MPD before the landmark comes about. So like I said, stay tuned. As soon as we have it finalized, we will share the document in our newsletter. HPO will share it. So we will definitely get that out to everyone. Thank you, Kim.
Yeah.
And
Thank
thank
you,
you,
Kim.
Heather. This was great. I mean, there was so much good information tonight, per usual,
Thanks.
and
Thanks.
I appreciate all of your just detailed research that you did on this topic. And
Thank
you're really going
you.
to add to the record for DC related to this history. Yes, and
It's
someone
been a
asked about.
pleasure. Oh,
Oh, I was just going to say, and someone was asking about the video, and yes, I'm going to get this uploaded. It will be on YouTube tomorrow, and we'll share it with all the attendees. So, Heather, once again, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who attended tonight. Hope you learned something. And if you have any questions at all about this, feel free to reach out to Heather. You can reach out to DCPL, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. So, thank you.
thank you. It's been a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.